The rancher gave his land to a family nobody wanted on it. By dawn, hundreds would arrive to answer what he'd done. But standing there that morning, watching smoke rise from their makeshift camp at the edge of his property, Dalton Mercer didn't know if he was about to save them or destroy everything he'd spent 20 years building. The woman refused to look at him. Her children hid behind her worn skirts, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching horses meant his time to decide was running out. What he didn't know was that his choice would bring an entire people to his doorstep before the sun rose again. 3 days earlier, Dalton had found them. He'd been riding the fence line when he spotted the thin trail of smoke cutting through the morning air. At first, he thought it was drifters passing through. Then he saw the shelter, barely more than canvas stretched between dead branches, and the woman crouched over a fire that gave more smoke than heat. 2 children sat close to her. The boy, maybe 8 years old, watched Dalton with eyes that held too much suspicion for his age. The girl, younger, pressed against her mother's side. Dalton stayed on his horse, one hand resting on the pommel. The woman didn't stand, didn't run. She just stared into the struggling flames like he wasn't there. He recognized the way she held herself. Proud, even with nothing left to be proud about. He'd seen that kind of dignity before, a long time ago, in another face that looked too much like hers. His chest tightened. "You're on private land," he said, keeping his voice level. The woman's jaw clenched, but she didn't respond. The boy shifted, putting himself between Dalton and his mother. His small hands curled into fists. Dalton glanced at the camp. No food, no supplies. The canvas shelter had holes the wind cut straight through. These people weren't passing through. They had nowhere else to go. "There's a town half a day's ride east," he said. "You'd find help there." The woman finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark, burning with something that wasn't anger. It was worse than that. It was refusal. "We don't need help," she said. Her voice was quiet but edged like broken glass. "We'll be gone by morning." She was lying. Dalton could see it in the way her hands shook, in the hollow look of the children's faces. He should have ridden away, should have let them leave like she promised. But something stopped him. Something that felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He'd made a promise once, 20 years ago, to a man whose face he still saw when he closed his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman hesitated. Then, as if the word cost her something, she answered, "Kimimela." Dalton's throat went dry. That name. He knew that name. Not hers specifically, but the family it came from, the blood it carried. He looked at the boy again, then at the girl, saw the resemblance he'd tried to ignore. His hands tightened on the reins. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else entirely. Something that felt like the past reaching forward and grabbing him by the throat. But before he could speak, the sound of hooves echoed across the plain. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, heading straight toward them. And Dalton knew in that instant that everything was about to get much worse. The 3 riders came fast, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a warning. Dalton recognized them before they got close. Warren Hayes rode in front, flanked by his 2 sons. They owned the land to the south, and Warren had made his opinions about unwanted visitors clear more than once. Dalton dismounted slowly, putting himself between the approaching men and Kimimela's camp. Warren pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet away. He was a broad man with a face carved from years of squinting into the sun. His eyes swept over the camp, then settled on Dalton with something close to disappointment. "You lost, Mercer," Warren said. "Or just blind?" "They're leaving," Dalton said. "That's so?" Warren glanced past him at Kimimela, who stood now, one hand on her son's shoulder. "Doesn't look like leaving to me. Looks like settling." "By morning," Dalton said. "She gave her word." Warren spat into the dirt. "Her word." He said it like the phrase itself was worthless. "You know what happens when you let them stay, even for a night? More come, then more after that. Before you know it, you got a whole camp on your land, and good luck getting rid of them then." Dalton's jaw tightened. "I said she's leaving, and I'm saying you're making a mistake." Warren leaned forward in his saddle. "We got an understanding out here, Mercer. We look after our own. That means keeping our land clear of people who don't belong." "She's got children," Dalton said quietly. "So do I." Warren straightened. "And I'm thinking about their future, about what kind of territory we're leaving them. You want your land overrun, that's your choice. But when it spreads to mine, it becomes my problem." One of Warren's sons shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward the rifle strapped to his side. The movement was casual, almost absent, but Dalton saw it. Behind him, Kimimela's boy stepped forward, his small fists still clenched. "Dakota!" Kimimela said sharply. The boy froze but didn't step back. Warren noticed. His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Brave kid. Stupid, but brave." "Enough," Dalton said. The word came out harder than he intended. Warren studied him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "You're a fool, Mercer. Always have been. Soft Heart's gonna get you killed one day." He turned his horse, his sons following. But before they rode off, Warren looked back. "Sunrise," he said. "If they're still here, I'm coming back with more than words." The three men disappeared over the ridge, leaving only dust and tension behind. Dalton stood still, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over him like a heavy coat. He'd bought them time, maybe 12 hours. After that, Warren would return, and he wouldn't come alone. He turned to face Kimimela. She met his eyes with that same burning refusal, but now there was something else beneath it. Fear, not for herself, but for her children. "You should go," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "This isn't your fight." Dalton looked at the boy Dakota, still standing guard despite being no bigger than a fence post. Looked at the little girl, peeking out from behind her mother's skirts with wide, hungry eyes. 20 years ago, a man had saved his life. A man who'd had no reason to, who'd risked everything to pull Dalton out of a situation he'd put himself into through arrogance and stupidity. That man had worn the same expression Kimimela wore now, that same dignity wrapped around desperation. Dalton had promised, with his last breath before passing out from blood loss, that he'd repay that debt, that if the man ever needed anything, Dalton would be there. The man's name had been Kuruk, and he'd been Kimimela's father. "It is my fight," Dalton said quietly. "More than you know." Kimimela's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" But before Dalton could answer, Dakota spoke up, his young voice cutting through the tension. "We won't leave," the boy said, "no matter what anyone says. This land belonged to my grandfather. My mother told me, and nobody can take that from us." The words hit Dalton like a fist to the chest, because the boy was right. This land had belonged to Kuruk 20 years ago, before boundaries were drawn and papers signed and everything changed. Before Dalton had bought it without knowing whose ground he was standing on. And now, standing in front of Kuruk's daughter and grandchildren, Dalton realized what he had to do, the only way to repay the debt, the only way to make things right. He had to give it all back. Dalton rode into town as the sun climbed higher, each mile adding weight to what he was about to do. By the time he reached the land office, his hands were steady but his mind was racing with every reason this was insane. The clerk, a thin man named Paulson who'd filed papers in this territory for 30 years, looked up from his desk with the expression of someone who'd seen everything twice. "Need to file a transfer," Dalton said. Paulson reached for a form without looking up. "Selling or buying?" "Giving." That got Paulson's attention. He set down his pen and studied Dalton like he was trying to determine if the man was drunk or just stupid. "Giving," Paulson repeated slowly. "As in, no payment exchanged?" "That's right." "To who?" "A woman named Kimimela." Dalton spelled it out. "Don't have a family name yet, but I will." Paulson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on the desk. "That's not how this usually works, Mercer. You understand what you're doing. Once I file this, it's done. Can't undo it because you changed your mind." "I know." "And the land in question?" "All of it," Dalton said. "Every acre I own." Paulson's drumming stopped. "You're giving away your entire ranch?" "Yes." "To a woman you just met. To the daughter of a man who saved my life 20 years ago." Paulson studied him for another long moment, then shook his head and pulled out the proper forms. "Your funeral, Mercer, but I need her full name, and she needs to sign. Both of you need to be here. I'll bring her before sunset. Better make it before Warren Hayes hears about this." Paulson muttered. "Man's gonna have opinions." Dalton left the office with the unsigned papers folded in his coat pocket. The ride back felt longer than the ride in. Every hoofbeat a countdown to the moment Kimimela would have to choose between her pride and her children's survival. When he reached the camp, she was packing what little they had. The canvas shelter was already down. The fire was out. True to her word, she was preparing to leave. Dakota saw him first. The boy stepped in front of his mother again. Same defensive stance, same useless courage. Dalton dismounted and pulled the papers from his pocket. "You said this land belonged to your grandfather," he said, looking at Kimimela. "You were right." It did. Her hands stilled on the bundle she was tying. "Your father was Kuruk," Dalton continued. 20 years ago, he pulled me out of a gorge after my horse threw me. I'd broken my leg, cracked my ribs. I was bleeding out. He didn't know me, had no reason to help, but he did anyway. Carried me 2 miles to the nearest settlement, stayed until he knew I'd live. Kimimela's face was unreadable, but her knuckles had gone white where she gripped the canvas. "Before he left, I made him a promise," Dalton said, "that if he or his family ever needed anything, I'd be there." He laughed, said promises from dying men don't count, but I meant it. "My father died 6 years ago," Kimimela said quietly. "I know. I heard." Dalton held out the papers. This land was his before the territory was surveyed, before boundaries were drawn up and sold to men like me who didn't know what they were taking. I can't change what happened, but I can give it back. Kimimela stared at the documents like they might catch fire in his hands. "These are transfer papers," Dalton said. "Sign them, and this land becomes yours. All of it. The house, the corral, the water rights, everything." "Why?" The word came out sharp, edged with suspicion. "Because it's the right thing to do," Dalton said simply. "And because your father saved my life. This is how I pay that debt." Kimimela didn't move, didn't reach for the papers. "I don't want your guilt," she said. "It's not about guilt." Dalton's voice was steady. "It's about honor. Your father understood that. I think you do too." Dakota was looking between them, confusion written across his young face. The little girl had stopped crying and was watching with wide eyes. "If I sign those," Kimimela said slowly, "what happens to you?" "I leave," Dalton said. "Find work somewhere else. I've done it before." "And Warren Hayes? Won't have grounds to complain. The land will be yours legally. He can hate it all he wants, but there's nothing he can do." Kimimela looked down at her children. At Dakota, trying so hard to be brave. At her daughter, too young to understand what hunger really meant yet. Then she looked back at the camp, at the worn canvas, and the cold fire, and the impossible weight of keeping them alive another day. When she finally reached for the papers, her hand shook. They rode to town together in silence. Kimimela sat stiff in the saddle, the papers clutched against her chest. Dakota and his sister rode double on Dalton's horse, the boy still watching him with those suspicious eyes. Paulson filed the paperwork with the same expressionless efficiency he used for everything. When it was done, he handed Kimimela a copy and looked at Dalton. "You just made yourself homeless, Mercer." "I know," Dalton said. They rode back as the sun began its descent. When they reached the property, Kimimela stopped at the edge of what was now her land, and turned to face him. "My brother needs to know about this," she said. "Your brother?" "Neshoba. He leads our people now. If I don't tell him what you've done, someone else will, and he'll come looking for answers." Dalton nodded. "Tell him whatever you need to." Kimimela's expression softened, just barely. Not gratitude. Something more complicated than that. Recognition, maybe, of a debt acknowledged, if not fully repaid. "He'll want to meet you," she said, "to understand why." "Then I'll be here," Dalton said. But what neither of them knew was that the news would travel faster than either expected. That by nightfall, a rider would reach Neshoba's camp with word of what had happened, and that the leader would make a decision that would bring not just him, but every member of his people, to that land by dawn, to witness, to understand, and to honor a debt that went deeper than either Dalton or Kimimela realized. The rider reached Neshoba's camp as darkness settled over the territory. He dismounted quickly, breathing hard, and went straight to the largest dwelling where firelight flickered through the opening. Neshoba sat with 3 elders, discussing the coming season's movements. He was a man built from hard decisions and harder winters, with a face that showed every year of leadership. When the rider entered, he looked up with the kind of patience that came from knowing bad news always arrived eventually. "Speak," Neshoba said. The rider glanced at the elders, then back to Neshoba. "It's about your sister." Neshoba's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. He set down the piece of leather he'd been working and gave the rider his full attention. "What about Kimimela?" "A rancher gave her his land, all of it. Signed the papers today in town. She owns it now, legally." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled. Outside, Children played in the last light of day, their voices carrying on the wind. "Which rancher?" Neshoba asked quietly. "Man named Dalton Mercer. Owned the property north of the Hayes territory." One of the elders leaned forward. "Why would he do this?" "Word is he owed a debt," the rider said. "To Kuruk." Neshoba's jaw tightened at his father's name. He stood slowly, his shadow stretching across the dwelling's walls. "How long has Kimimela been there?" he asked. 3 days, maybe 4, and she didn't send word. Guess she planned to. Eventually. Neshoba stepped outside, the night air cool against his face. Behind him, the elders followed, along with others who'd heard raised voices and came to see what warranted the interruption. His sister had always been stubborn, proud to the point of pain. After their father died, she'd refused help from anyone, insisted on making her own way even when it meant her children went hungry. Neshoba had tried to bring her back to the tribe more times than he could count, but Kimimela always said the same thing. She wouldn't be a burden. Now, a stranger had done what her own brother couldn't, had given her the one thing that meant security: land. Not just any land, but ground that had once belonged to their father, before boundaries and papers stole it away. "What does this man want in return?" Neshoba asked. The rider shook his head. "Nothing. That's what people are saying. He just gave it away and left. Told her it was the right thing to do." Neshoba looked out at the camp, at his people preparing for the night. Families gathered around fires, elders sharing stories with children. This was what his father had fought to protect, this sense of belonging, of home. And a stranger had just given that back to Kuruk's daughter. One of the elders, a woman named Ayana who'd known Kuruk since childhood, stepped beside Neshoba. "Your father spoke of a man once," she said quietly. "Many years ago. Said he'd pulled someone from death, a young rancher foolish enough to ride dangerous ground alone. Kuruk made light of it, but I remember him saying the man had honor, that he'd sworn a debt he didn't need to swear." Neshoba turned to her. "You think this is the same man?" "I think debts like that don't get forgotten," Ayana said. "Not by men with honor." Neshoba stood silent, weighing what this meant. A debt repaid, a promise kept. In a world where their people had been pushed and broken and promised things that never came, here was a man who'd given up everything to keep his word. That meant something. That meant everything. He looked at the gathered faces watching him, waiting for guidance. "At dawn," Neshoba said, his voice carrying across the camp, "we ride, all of us, every person who can sit a horse." One of the younger men stepped forward. "Why? If Kimimela has land, she's safe. We don't need to interfere." "This isn't interference," Neshoba said. "This is witness. A man honored our father by keeping a promise most would have forgotten. That deserves acknowledgement. That deserves to be seen." Ayana nodded slowly. "The old ways. When one shows honor, all must recognize it." "Exactly." Neshoba's gaze swept across his people. "We ride to show this man that what he did matters. That honor still means something, and to make sure he understands that Kimimela doesn't stand alone. She has a family, a people, and we protect our own." The camp erupted into movement. Preparations began immediately. Horses were gathered, supplies packed. Children asked questions their parents answered in hushed, serious tones. But in the back of Neshoba's mind, another thought circled. Warren Hayes owned land near Mercer's property, and Hayes was known for his opinions about who belonged on this territory and who didn't. If Hayes took issue with Kimimela's claim, there would be trouble. The kind of trouble that required more than words to resolve, which was exactly why Neshoba intended to arrive with enough people to make Hayes think twice about starting something he couldn't finish. By dawn, they would ride. And whatever happened next, Kimimela would know she wasn't facing it alone. Dalton didn't sleep. He sat on the porch of the house that was no longer his, watching the night sky slowly give way to the first hints of dawn. The property stretched out before him, familiar in a way that made leaving feel like tearing off skin. But it wasn't his anymore. He'd signed that away. Inside, Kimimela and her children slept in real beds for the first time in months. When she'd first stepped through the door, she'd frozen, as if crossing the threshold might break some unspoken rule. Dakota had no such hesitation. The boy ran straight to the main room, eyes wide at the simple furniture, the actual roof overhead, the stone fireplace that could hold a real fire. The little girl, whose name Dalton had learned was Elu, had cried, not from sadness, but from something that looked like relief so profound it hurt to carry. Kimimela had stood in the doorway and said nothing, just looked at Dalton with an expression he couldn't name. Then she'd taken her children inside and closed the door gently behind her. Dalton had spent the night out here, under stars that seemed closer than they had any right to be. Now, as light began to creep across the land, he heard the door open behind him. Kimimela stepped onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket. She'd cleaned up, her hair braided, her face showing exhaustion that went bone deep. "You should have slept inside," she said. "Didn't feel right." "It's your house." "Was," Dalton corrected quietly. "Not anymore." Kimimela sat down beside him, keeping distance between them but not as much as before. For a while, neither spoke. They just watched the sky turn from black to deep blue to the color of smoke. "My brother is coming," Kimimela said finally. Dalton nodded. "I figured he would. He's bringing everyone." That made Dalton turn to look at her. Everyone? That's what he does when something important happens. When honor needs to be witnessed. He brings the whole tribe so everyone sees, everyone remembers. Her voice was steady but quiet. "You should know. He's not coming to thank you. He's coming to understand why you did this. And to make sure no one tries to take it back." "Hayes," Dalton said. "Yes. If Warren comes back with his men, my brother wants to make sure we're not alone." The horizon was lighter now. Dalton could make out the fence line, the distant trees, the shape of the land he'd worked for 20 years. "I don't want a war over this," he said. "Then you should have thought about that before you gave away your ranch." Kimimela's tone wasn't cruel, just factual. "This territory doesn't forgive kindness. People like Warren see it as weakness." "It wasn't kindness," Dalton said. "It was a debt. Same thing to men like him." Footsteps approached from the south, fast and heavy. Dalton stood, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip where his rifle should have been. But he'd left it inside, not wanting to greet dawn armed. 3 riders appeared through the morning haze. Warren Hayes and his sons, right on schedule. Warren pulled up hard when he saw Dalton and Kimimela standing together on the porch. His face went through several expressions before settling on anger. "The hell is this, Mercer?" "She owns this land now," Dalton said evenly. "Legally filed yesterday. You got a problem with that? Take it up with the territorial office." Warren's horse stamped, sensing its rider's tension. "You're telling me you gave your entire ranch to some woman you don't even know?" "She's Kuruk's daughter. That's all I need to know. Kuruk's been dead 6 years. Debt doesn't die with the man." Warren looked like he wanted to spit, but he held it back. His eyes moved from Dalton to Kimimela, then to the house behind them, calculating, weighing options. "You're a fool, Mercer. You know what this means. You just invited every displaced family in the territory to squat on working land, expecting handouts." "She's not squatting," Dalton said. "She owns it. For now." Warren's voice dropped. "But land has a way of changing hands, especially when people don't know how to hold on to it." The threat was clear. Kimimela stepped forward, her shoulders squared despite the blanket around her shoulders making her look smaller than she was. "I know how to hold on to what's mine," she said. Warren smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We'll see." He turned his horse, his sons following, but before they rode off, one of them looked back and said something Dalton couldn't hear. Warren nodded. When they were gone, Kimimela let out a breath she'd been holding. "They'll come back," she said. "I know. With more men." "I know. Good thing my brother's bringing more too." Dalton looked east, toward the direction Neshoba would come from. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. And on the horizon, barely visible through the morning light, he saw them. Riders. Dozens of them. Moving in formation, steady and purposeful. Kimimela saw them too. She stood straighter, the blanket falling from her shoulders. "They're here," she whispered, and they kept coming. More and more, until the horizon seemed filled with them. Not an army, not a threat. Something else entirely. A people, coming to witness what honor looked like. They came in silence. No war cries, no threats. Just the steady sound of hundreds of horses moving across open ground as the sun climbed higher. Dalton stood at the edge of the property, watching them approach. Behind him, Kimimela held her children close. Dakota's eyes were wide, but not with fear, with recognition. These were his people, coming like a river that couldn't be stopped. The riders formed a wide semicircle, stopping 50 yards from the house. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to be unmistakable. A wall of witnesses. One man rode forward alone. He wore a headdress that marked him as a leader, but it was the way he sat his horse that told Dalton everything he needed to know. This was a man who carried the weight of his people on his shoulders, and had learned not to bend under it. Neshoba dismounted 20 feet from Dalton. He stood there, studying the rancher with eyes that looked too much like Kimimela's. Then he turned and looked at his sister, at her children, at the house behind them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the quiet morning. "You are the man who gave my sister this land." It wasn't a question. Dalton nodded anyway. "Yes. Why?" Dalton had expected that question, had practiced answers in his head all night, but standing here with hundreds of people watching and the weight of 20 years pressing down on him, all the practiced words felt hollow. "Your father saved my life," he said simply. "I promised him I'd repay that debt. This was the only way I knew how." Neshoba's expression didn't change. "My father died 6 years ago. You could have forgotten that promise. Most men would have. Most men didn't owe Kuruk what I owed him." "What did you owe him?" Dalton took a breath. This was the part he'd never told anyone. The part that made the debt real. 20 years ago I was young and stupid. Thought I knew these lands better than I did. Rode out alone to scout territory I wanted to claim. My horse threw me in a gorge. I fell 30 feet, broke my leg in 2 places, cracked 3 ribs. By the time I stopped rolling, I was bleeding from a gash in my side that should have ended me. He paused. The memory as sharp as the pain had been. Your father found me by accident, was tracking game, heard my horse panicking. He climbed down into that gorge, and when he saw me, he could have kept walking. I was nobody to him, a stranger who'd probably caused his people nothing but trouble. Kimimela was listening now, her eyes fixed on Dalton. "But he didn't walk away," Dalton continued. "He bound my wounds with strips from his own shirt. Then he carried me on his back, 2 miles through rough country to the nearest settlement. Stayed with me until the doctor said I'd live. I was in and out of consciousness, but I remember his face. Remember the way he looked at me when I tried to thank him." "What did he say?" Neshoba asked quietly. "He said a man doesn't need thanks for doing what's right. That life is sacred, no matter whose life it is." Then he left. I never saw him again. The morning air felt heavy with unspoken things. Behind Neshoba, the gathered people sat still as stone, listening to every word. "Before he left," Dalton said, "I made him promise to come find me if he ever needed anything. Swore on my life I'd repay what he'd given me. He smiled and said dying men make promises they can't keep. But I meant it. Kept that promise in my chest for 20 years. Neshoba looked at his sister. Some silent understanding passed between them. "You gave up everything you had," Neshoba said, turning back to Dalton. "Your land, your home, your future. For a promise to a dead man, for a debt to a good one." Neshoba stepped closer, close enough that Dalton could see the lines around his eyes, the scars on his hands, the weight of leadership that never truly lifted. "My father spoke of you," Neshoba said. "Before he died, said he'd once helped a young rancher. Said the man had honor, even though he was foolish." Dalton almost smiled at that. He wasn't wrong. "He also said," Neshoba continued, "that he hoped you'd forgotten the promise, because carrying a debt like that for years would be a heavy burden." "It was," Dalton admitted, "but it was mine to carry." Neshoba studied him for a long moment. Then he raised his hand, and from the gathered riders, 3 people dismounted and came forward. 2 men and the elder woman, Ayana, who carried something wrapped in cloth. She approached Dalton and unwrapped the object carefully. Inside was a knife, the handle carved from bone, the blade worn, but well-maintained. "This was Kuruk's," Ayana said. "He carried it his entire life. When he died, we saved it for someone worthy of receiving it." She held it out to Dalton. He didn't move. Couldn't. His throat had gone tight. "I can't take that." "You must," Ayana said firmly. "Because you honored my friend's memory when the world had forgotten him. You kept a promise when it cost you everything. That makes you worthy." Dalton took the knife with hands that weren't quite steady. The handle was smooth from years of use, warm in his palm. Neshoba stepped beside him, his voice low enough that only Dalton could hear. "You gave my sister land, but you gave my people something more valuable. You reminded us that honor still exists in men who don't share our blood." He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "This man has shown us what it means to keep faith, to honor the dead by caring for the living. We came to witness this, to remember, and to make sure the world knows that Kimimela does not stand alone. Behind him, the gathered people began to dismount, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. They had come to honor a debt repaid, and now they would make sure that land stayed in the hands it belonged to. The sound of approaching horses from the south made everyone turn. Warren Hayes rode hard, and this time he'd brought more than his sons. 8 men rode with him, all armed, all wearing expressions that said they'd come expecting trouble. Warren pulled up short when he saw the gathered people. His eyes swept across the hundreds of riders, the families dismounting, the children playing near the house where Kimimela's daughter watched with wide eyes. "The hell is this, Mercer?" Warren's voice was loud, meant to carry. "You start a war." Neshoba stepped forward before Dalton could respond. He moved with deliberate calm, his hands visible and empty. "There is no war here," Neshoba said. "Only family, coming to see that our sister has what belongs to her." Warren's jaw worked. He looked from Neshoba to Dalton, to the house where Kimimela stood on the porch, Dakota beside her. "That land was sold legal," Warren said. 20 years ago. Mercer bought it fair. "And yesterday," Neshoba replied evenly, "he gave it back. Also legal. Papers filed in town. You can check yourself. I know what he did." Warren's horse stamped, sensing its rider's frustration. "I'm here to tell you it's not going to stand. Territory law says land can be challenged if the owner can't maintain it, and I don't see how 1 woman and 2 kids are going to work a ranch this size." "She won't be alone," Neshoba said. "That a threat?" "It's a fact." Neshoba's voice remained level, but something in his tone had shifted. "My sister has family. We protect our own, and we work the land we're given. Always have." One of Warren's men leaned in, whispering something. Warren's face darkened. "You think numbers scare me?" Warren said. "You think showing up here with half your tribe makes this legal?" "It was already legal before we arrived," Neshoba said. "We're just making sure everyone knows it." Warren turned his attention back to Dalton. "You're really going to stand there and let this happen? Let them take everything you built?" "I didn't let them take anything," Dalton said quietly. "I gave it freely, to repay some imaginary debt to a dead man, to honor a promise to a good one." Warren spat into the dirt. "You're a fool, Mercer. And you," he looked at Neshoba, "you think this changes anything? You think 1 piece of land makes a difference?" "It makes a difference to her," Neshoba said, nodding toward Kimimela. "To her children, to everyone here who remembers when this land was ours and no papers existed to say otherwise." "Well, it does now," Warren said. "And if you can't hold it, someone else will take it. That's how this territory works." "Then we'll hold it," Neshoba said simply. The 2 men stared at each other. Warren's hand rested on his rifle, but he didn't draw it. Couldn't. Not with this many witnesses. Not with families present. Not with the sun rising higher, and the morning carrying everything said into permanence. Finally, Warren pulled his horse around. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Neshoba replied. "It is." Warren rode off, his men following. They disappeared over the ridge, leaving dust and tension in their wake. Slowly, the gathered people began to relax. Some returned to their horses. Others moved toward the house toward Kimimela, offering words in a language Dalton didn't understand but recognized as comfort. Ayanna approached him again, her weathered face creased with something that might have been approval. "You stood between them," she said. "Didn't do much standing," Dalton replied. "You stood by your word. That's the only standing that matters." She returned to the others, leaving Dalton alone with Neshoba. "Hayes will come back," Dalton said quietly. "Let him." Neshoba looked across the property, at the land his father once walked. "He'll find the same thing waiting, people who won't be moved. He can hate it all he wants. But the law is the law, and more than that, this is right. Right doesn't always win." "No," Neshoba agreed, "but it has a better chance when people witness it. When enough voices say this is how it should be. That's why we came. Not to fight, to be seen." He turned to Dalton. "You have no home now." It wasn't a question, but Dalton answered anyway. "No. My father would want you looked after, the way he looked after you in that gorge. I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Neshoba said. "It's the same thing you gave my sister, a place to stand, a chance to belong somewhere." Before Dalton could respond, Dakota ran up, his young face bright with excitement. The elder says you can stay, the boy said breathlessly. In the old barn. It's not the house, but it's better than nothing. And mother says you know how to work the land. We need that. Need someone who knows what to do. Kimimela approached behind her son, her expression complicated. You don't have to stay, she said. You've done enough. But you could, Dakota added quickly, if you wanted. Dalton looked at the boy, at Kimimela, at the land stretching out under morning sun. 20 years he'd worked this ground. 20 years of sweat and calluses in seasons that tested everything he had. He'd given it up, signed it away, made his peace with walking away from everything he'd built. But standing here now, with the boy looking at him like he mattered, with Kimimela's guarded hope, with Neshoba's quiet offer of belonging, Dalton realized something. Maybe the debt wasn't fully paid yet. Maybe there was still work to do. I'll stay, he said, long as you'll have me. Dakota grinned. Kimimela's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Neshoba placed a hand on Dalton's shoulder, the gesture brief but weighted with meaning. Around them, the people began to settle, not leaving. Not yet. They would stay a while, these witnesses to honor, would help repair fences and clear fields, and remind the world that this land had a family now. And come next sunrise, when they finally rode home, they would carry this story with them. The story of a rancher who kept a promise, of a sister who found her way back to belonging, of honor that transcended blood and history, and all the things that usually divided people. They would carry it, and they would remember. 3 weeks passed before the gathered people returned to their camps. But in those weeks, everything changed. The corral was repaired. The fences were mended. Fields that had gone wild were cleared and prepared for planting. Men and women worked side by side, their hands moving with the practiced efficiency of people who knew what land required. Dalton worked among them. Not as the owner anymore, but as something different, something that felt more honest. He showed them which fields flooded in heavy rain, where the best water ran, how to brace the barn walls against winter wind. Dakota followed him everywhere, asking questions faster than Dalton could answer them. The boy had energy that didn't quit, curiosity that wouldn't rest. He wanted to know everything about working the land, about horses, about how to read weather and the color of the sky. Why do you tie the fence posts that way? Dakota asked one afternoon, watching Dalton work. So they don't shift when cattle lean on them, Dalton explained, pulling the rope tight. But there's no cattle here. There will be. Your mother's going to need livestock if she wants this land to support you. Dakota considered this seriously. Will you teach me how to care for them? Dalton looked at the boy, saw Kuruk in the shape of his face, in the way he stood like he was ready for whatever came next. Yeah, Dalton said. I'll teach you. Kimimela watched these exchanges from a distance, her expression impossible to read. She'd thrown herself into the work with a determination that bordered on fierce. Every morning she was up before dawn. Every night she was the last to rest. But Dalton noticed the way her shoulders had lost some of their tension, the way she smiled when Elu laughed, the way she looked at the land now, not like something that might be taken away, but like something that belonged to her. One evening, as the work crews prepared to leave, Neshoba found Dalton by the barn. My people will return in spring, Neshoba said, to help with planting, and if Hayes comes back, we'll hear about it long before he arrives. You don't have to keep watching over us, Dalton said. Yes, Neshoba replied. We do, because this is more than one piece of land now. It's proof that things can be different. That honor still means something. We need that as much as you do. He placed his hand on Dalton's shoulder, the same gesture he'd given weeks ago, but weighted with something deeper now. Acceptance. Brotherhood. My father chose well, Neshoba said, when he pulled you from that gorge. Then he was gone, leading his people home under stars that seemed closer than they should be. Dalton stood alone in the quiet, listening to the night sounds. Crickets, wind through grass, the distant sound of horses settling in the corral. He'd given up everything he owned, lost the land he'd worked for 20 years, should have felt empty, should have felt lost. Instead, he felt lighter than he had in decades. Behind him, the barn door creaked open. Kimimela stepped out, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling air. The children are asleep, she said. Dalton nodded. They'd developed this routine over the past weeks, standing in comfortable silence, watching the land settle into night. Thank you, Kimimela said quietly. You've already said that. I know, but I'll keep saying it. She moved to stand beside him. What you did, what you gave up, I can never repay that. You're not supposed to, Dalton said. That's not how it works. Then how does it work? Dalton thought about that. About Kuruk carrying him through rough country. About promises kept across decades. About honor that transcended everything that usually divided people. I think, he said slowly, we just keep going. Keep working. Keep teaching your children what this land means. That's payment enough. Kimimela was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Dakota asked me yesterday if you were staying forever. What did you tell him? That I didn't know. That it was your choice. Dalton looked at the house, at the land stretching out under starlight, at everything he'd given away and somehow gotten back in a different form. I'm staying, he said, long as you'll have me. Kimimela smiled. Actually smiled. The first real one he'd seen from her. Then you'd better be ready. Spring planting is hard work, and Dakota's going to run you into the ground with questions. I can handle it, Dalton said. And he could, because this wasn't about ownership anymore. It wasn't about debts or promises or even honor, really. It was about belonging, about finding a place where your work mattered and your presence meant something, about becoming part of something bigger than yourself. The rancher had given his land to a family that needed it. At dawn, their entire tribe had come to witness what honor looked like. And in the end, everyone found exactly what they'd been searching for. A home, a family, a reason to keep moving forward. The land would remember this. The people would carry the story. And years from now, when Dakota was grown and teaching his own children how to work these fields, he'd tell them about the rancher who kept a promise, the man who proved that some debts are worth paying, no matter the cost. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and honor shape destinies in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.